classes. I would just ask that you wait between performance and pieces. So I'm very excited to talk to you guys today because I get to talk about two things that are very important to me and have had a lot of impact on me as a performer and as a musician. And that is the world of marching percussion, the very highly technical and regimented world of marching percussion, and the very soloistic and individualistic world of solo marimba. Now these two fields often develop in tandem, with students working on solo marimba pieces while they're involved in marching arts, or solo marimbas having done marching arts in the past, but rarely do they actually interact in any sort of meaningful way together. They really kind of exist within their own kinds of worlds. So today I would like to take the time to talk about these two areas of the percussion world: the highly structured technical environment marching percussion and the individual interpretive world of solo marimba performance, and how we can integrate them together to actually develop a more cohesive approach to solo marimba playing. So when we think of the marching arts, if you've been to a marching band contest and you've seen a halftime show, one of the things you're probably immediately taken aback by is the sense of uniformity from player to player and the overall cohesion of the group. When you watch 100, 200, 300, sometimes 400 or more players all working together as one singular unit, the end effect is very, very impressive. Now, the way that we are able to achieve that is by building from a very technical and structured approach. So in this video behind me, this is the Boston Crusaders Drum and Bugle Corps, which is my corps. You can see as from player to player, from the way they move their heads, to their shoulders, to their wrists, to their mallets, everything is very, very choreographed and measured like to the inch to make sure it looks identical from player to player. And this is really what makes this activity so, so impressive. Now the way that we build that is we start with technical exercises where we can define very specific things and then build from there. So at the beginning of the season, students will receive a warm-up packet or an exercise book in which they will work through all these exercises. We define all the different parameters to it, and then those are then applied to show music. The problem when it comes to marching arts is there's not a lot of room when it comes to being able to be individualistic. It's really antithetical to the whole approach. If everybody's supposed to be looking the same, it doesn't really make sense for one person to try to interpret something differently or try to put themselves in their own kind of way into the actual piece. So again, emphasis on the technique is very, very effective in trying to teach how to play well on the instrument. Uniformity, being able to match from player to player, is very, very effective. And then also the techniques that are used from the exercises and then applied to the music themselves. Contrary to that would be the world of solo marimba playing. So this is an example of Eriko Daimo performing her arrangement of Sibelius's Pussy. In this video, immediately you can see the difference in approach to the keyboard. As you're watching her play, it's incredibly soloistic, very expressive. If she were to try to play this piece 2 times in a row, most likely she would not play it the exact same way. To try to get 2 players to be able to mimic this kind of expression would be very, very difficult. So it allows for the player to have this individual expression on the keyboard. So a lot of the things that are really good about playing solo marimba is it really encourages you to make your own choices, find your own voice when it comes to the keyboard. If we look at solo marimba competitions, one of the trending characteristics of people who are winning these contests are the players that are able to show themselves through the performance. That's a common theme of, I could really see that person in a performance. Additionally, there's a wide range of repertoire when it comes to solo marimba. We have guitar, piano arrangements, as well as a vast array of solo marimba works, as well as the ability to hear and control nuances of the instrument. That's not to say that we cannot do that within the marching percussion field, but within the solo marimba field and category, it's a lot easier to control those subtleties to the instrument. Now, the con to when it comes to solo marimba playing is there isn't an inherent pedagogical system for breaking down passages to the same extent that we have within marching percussion. If I am handed a solo piece for marimba, it does not come with exercises to pair to it that I can practice to develop the technique when it comes to learning the piece. Most often, students fall in the habit of learning one measure at a time, and then another measure, and then another measure, and then we stick all those measures together, and then we repeat that process until we've learned and memorized the entire piece. This ends up being relatively problematic because a lot of the issues that are underlying within the music aren't actually fixed. We just kind of keep repeating all these bad practice habits, and we don't actually address the underlying issues. But in this, if we are able to integrate the regiment of the technical marimba world, or technical marching percussion world with the solo marimba world, we can actually remedy a lot of these issues. So, in this lecture, I will demonstrate a systematic method that applies technical exercises from marching percussion school of thought to the study of solo marimba literature. In doing so, I will demonstrate a pedagogical approach that not only teaches a deeper understanding, more comprehensive understanding of the keyboard, but will also teach improvisational skills. By combining the technical approach and vocabulary of marching percussion to the structure of solo marimba music, students are improvising and engaging with the creating process. Now, I specifically use the creating process because this idea of creation is very, very important when it comes to being able to qualify if we understand a subject. So I want to bring up this visual here. So this lovely rainbow-colored visual up here is Bloom's taxonomy. This is based on Benjamin Bloom, an educational psychologist, his hierarchical understanding, or how we can actually define if we comprehend a subject. So at the bottom of this staircase is remember. This is the most basic way of demonstrating if we actually have an understanding of a subject. So if I say something and you repeat it back to me, that is the most basic way of demonstrating that we can understand the subject. All the way up to create. Create is defined as the highest level of demonstrating that you are able to understand a subject. So when we look at creation, Bloom's definition of creating would be the reorganizing of elements into a new pattern or structure through generating, planning, or producing. Or otherwise reworded in the context of my research, reorganizing technical exercises into a piece of solo music through a predetermined framework. Now, when we think of creating within music, we generally think of two things. We think of composition and we think of improvisation. Now, it's not to say that there are not other areas that we can identify as creating within music, but generally speaking, if we think of creating in music, that's what the most common things we lean on are composition and improvisation, or composition being the process of creating the music, learning it, and then performing it, or improvisation being the process of understanding the vocabulary and then applying it in a live situation. And when it comes to improvisation, this is not something that we inherently teach very often on the solo marimba, but it is something that many of the masters of our field actually do quite regularly. Renowned professor of percussion at the University of North Texas, Mark Ford, during his daily practice routine, he will, quote, start off with improvisation and may continue for 10 to 30 minutes. So during his regular daily routine of practicing, he will actually integrate almost a half hour of practicing improvisation. Professor Emeritus at Ithaca College, Gordon Stout, always starts with technique and accuracy-based exercises, but that, quote, often leads to improvising and coming up with ideas for pieces. Usually this departure from technical exercises occurs while doing double vertical strokes in both hands. Double vertical strokes being a technique we will address later. And then also, I wanted to put this quote up here in particular. This is a quote by Keiko Abe. Keiko Abe is one of the absolute masters of our instrument, and the reason we even have this instrument in its construction like this and its popularity around the world is largely due to her contribution to the field. She says, I've always been concerned about making my own performance as rich and varied as possible. I had to find a way to ensure 100% concentration during performances and to achieve a creative space in my playing that transcends mere technique. I did not achieve that goal until I began to improvise, both alone and in ensemble. Again, I did not achieve that goal until I began to improvise. Keiko Abe, one of the true masters of our field, credits improvisation, the integration of improvisation into her practice for achieving this transcendental realization of her playing. Now, when it comes to improvisation, there's a common misconception of how we actually think of improvisation. There's again, the common misconception that if we are improvising, we are just kind of pulling ideas from just the ether, and then we kind of put them out there, and then all of a sudden that's improvisation. When realistically, that's not really how it works. So if we were to look at a genre that's very well known for improvisation, like jazz, if we were looking at jazz and we take John Coltrane playing over giant steps. If John Coltrane is improvising over giant steps, he's not just putting his fingers down and hoping that the right notes kind of come out in the correct way or something that sounds good. Now he is actually drawing on practiced vocabulary, very specific melodic ideas that he then pulls from and applies in a live situation. There's a very specific vocabulary that he draws from and then applies within the musical structure that he is improvising over. So, in today's presentation, I'll begin by briefly outlining the theoretical framework that informs this project and discussing the technical vocabulary of marching percussion pedagogy. I will then present the method itself and demonstrate how these ideas can be applied to several works from the solo marimba repertoire. Through these examples, I will demonstrate how the application of marching percussion pedagogy to the study of solo marimba literature can serve not only as a tool for building technical facility, but also as a gateway to improvisation and creative music making. Now, before we get to the method, I want to briefly talk about why the way we practice and teach marching percussion is so effective. So in my research and preparing all of this, I wanted to make sure that the method that I'm proposing is grounded in the correct pedagogical approach that makes a lot of sense. So I did a lot of research on practice theory and how we should practice. And I came across this quote by Da Vinci that was quite poignant. Those who fall in love with practice without knowledge are like a sailor who gets into a ship without rudder or compass and who never can be certain whither he is going. Practice must always be founded on sound theory. Now, when we look at practice theory, there are lots of different people who have researched this in depth. One of the well-known people or books that was written was Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers. If you're not familiar with Outliers, you're probably familiar with the concept of the 10,000-hour rule. 10,000-hour rule basically states if you put enough time in on a subject, you can master it. So in Gladwell's book, he used the example of the Beatles going back from Liverpool to Hamburg and putting in their 10,000 hours before they became famous, or Bill Gates punching cards to build the internet. Now, while this concept is certainly rooted in fact, realistically it kind of misses a big point of practice. And much of his research is actually based on another psychologist, Carl Anders Ericsson, and he writes in his book that practice should actually be broken down into 3 different categories. We have naive practice, we have purposeful practice, and we have deliberate practice. So naive practice would be akin to kind of what I was describing with marimba earlier. We learn one measure, then another measure, and then another measure, we stick them all together, and we repeat the process repeatedly until we've memorized the whole thing. We don't have a specific way of breaking things down, we're merely just kind of going through the same steps over and over and over. The next section, which this is what my method really tries to get at, is purposeful practice. So in order for something to be purposeful, it has to be focused, it has to have creative resources to actually break things, different passages down, and we have to have a way to address temporary plateaus within our practice sessions. Then we have deliberate practice. The really defining difference between deliberate practice and purposeful practice is that we have an instructor standing in front of us. So if I'm in a front ensemble rehearsal and I have my instructor who is actively standing in front of me, giving me feedback, tailoring exercises, and adjusting things, that would be deliberate practice. Or if we're in a private lesson and we have our instructor who is an expert at what we're working on, is able to make those adjustments in real time for us. So again, my research in this method specifically tries to get at purposeful practice. Now let's get to the actual method. So I named my method the pit method. If we're talking about the front ensemble is synonymous with the word pit. So if you're watching marching band, drum corps, you see the group of keyboard instruments in front of you, that is the pit or the front ensemble. The words are interchangeable. Or specifically, the percussion improvisation teaching method. Now what this does is it creates a structured practice approach. It integrates the technical exercises from the marching percussion pedagogical approach, and in doing so, we are actually teaching students how to improvise by combining technical vocabulary into a structured melodic framework. Now, in order to make sure that the vocabulary that I'm pulling from within the marching percussion world is accurate and applicable, I need to make sure that I drew from a wide range of resources. So for this research, I actually was able to find 15 different front ensemble packets. I know this is tiny print. The individual groups themselves are not necessarily important. What is important is the fact that we have a large variety of groups. So within this, we have 5 drum corps groups, we have 5 indoor percussion groups, and we have 5 high school percussion groups. In doing so, we're trying to make sure we have a nice span and a nice source for the different material. And even within this, we have some, like there's Cavaliers 2023 was a first place group, down to some of the lower high school groups, having a full range to draw from. Now, when we're looking at these exercises, all of these exercises actually break down into 4 different stroke types. And now, finally get to the playing the marimba. So, when we look at these exercise packets, they're not specifically organized this way, but each one is built around a specific stroke type. Now, the reason that these are important is these are our building blocks for how we actually can play and write for the keyboard. So first we have our double vertical strokes. Double vertical strokes would be, if I have 2 mallets in each hand, they start at the top of the stroke and they play the keyboard at exactly the same time. I can do this with both hands as well. I can also alternate or oscillate between each hand. This is how we would play rolls. So if I'm trying to create the illusion of sustain on the keyboard, we obviously don't have very much sustain, so we play the notes repeatedly. The most common way to do that is with double vertical strokes between hand to hand. The second common stroke type would be our single independence. This is going to be our stroke type that we use to play scales. So ubiquitously between all of these different packets, there were green scales we're using it. Green scales is based off of a xylophonist from 100 years ago, and we're still using his scale patterns now. So scale patterns would be using single independent strokes. Basically, I'm just using 1 mallet at a time in each hand. So if I were to play this, each mallet in each hand is moving simultaneously or individually by itself. Now this can be used between inside or outside mallets. So there's a popular exercise called 8 on a mallet. Each mallet is moving independently of the other mallets. Next would be our single alternating stroke. This is when we alternate between each mallet within one hand. It's very common if we have to play something that uses maybe like an Alberti bass line. And I'm shifting back and forth between each of my mallets in one hand. And then the last stroke would be our lateral strokes. Lateral strokes, if we're comparing this to playing drums, would be like a diddle. Basically, we turn the wrist like we're going to play a double vertical stroke, but at the very last second, I rotate in order to get 2 notes out of one motion. As we speed this up, it starts to become what we call a ripple roll. But again, this is a nice way to just vary up our textures within our rolls. So these are our 4 basic stroke types that we can break any passage down into. So now, in analyzing these different packets, the most common exercises that we saw were single independent strokes. The reason for this being is that we largely see scale passages in a lot of different variations. I mentioned the green scales earlier. There are many, many different variations on green scales, so we generally, a lot of them are included into these exercise packets. The second reason why this is the most common is we're talking about a music in a balance perspective. It's much easier to get 10 to 15 keyboard players in the front to balance to the 100 players behind them if we're playing unison scale passages. Just purely from a balance perspective, that's very, very effective. Next most common would be our double vertical strokes. Again, I mentioned this in the quote by Gordon Stout. Double verticals are a very easy way to approach and introduce 4-mallet playing. Next would be lateral strokes. Again, our diddle strokes would be third most common. Then we have our single alternating strokes. Now the reason why single alternating strokes are fourth is because they are actually superimposed onto double vertical stroke exercises. So and I'll demonstrate that here in a bit, but if we have a double vertical stroke, it's very easy to alternate between other exercises on top of that. Now I've included a 5th category, combination of strokes. The only reason I included this is because there was a very specific example in one of the packets, so I felt it necessary to include this. It was only found in one example. Basically what a combination of strokes is literally a combination stroke. We are taking 2 different stroke types and we are using them back and forth. So if I were to do a double vertical, today, we're going to be looking at 5 different works. First, we're going to be looking at A Little Prayer by Evelyn Glennie. Then we're going to be looking at Anthem by Ivan Trevino. Next will be the Bach Cello Suite Prelude in G major. Then Japanese Children's Songs by Keiko Abe. And finally, My Lady White by David Maslanka. So this first work, A Little Prayer by Evelyn Glennie, comes from a work called 3 Chorales by Evelyn Glennie. And when we play chorales on the marimba, it's understood that we will play double verticals or moving quickly back and forth between our hands. Now, as you can see from the music, it's a lot of half notes, whole notes, quarter notes. We would not be able to play just sustained notes. So we would actually roll back and forth very quickly with double vertical strokes. So I'll go ahead and play these first 8 measures of this piece, and you can hear a bit of this. So as you can see, primarily I'm using double vertical strokes back and forth in a very quick oscillation. So now, I want to actually move to a front ensemble exercise. So this is an exercise called hyperspace. There are lots of double vertical exercises. Oftentimes a group will make up their own. Basically what this is taking a bass chord structure or chord progression and then applying these stroke types to the top, over it. So just as a demonstration of what a double vertical exercise would look like, I'll play the first section of hyperspace. Essentially, all this is taking a very fundamental chord structure, applying one stroke type to it, and then making sure we are all matching the same stroke types and shifting between chords effectively. Now, one of the things that is to jump back to Evelyn Glennie, one of the things that's very, very difficult about playing chorales or rolls is my hands, when I'm playing a passage like this, are actually moving very fast. So I'm rolling out of it. That's a relatively quick speed. If I were to apply that to a double vertical exercise, that's actually shifting between chords quite fast. So one of the issues that happens when we're playing chorales is we end up not actually shifting chords at the correct time or in with the correct subdivision. And we end up shuffling notes. So we get this kind of result. If we were to take an exercise like hyperspace or a double vertical exercise like that and apply it to Evelyn Glennie's A Little Prayer, we would actually be able to get rid of those issues by isolating just one stroke type. So if we were to combine these two, we would end up with this. Exercise 2, Evelyn Glennie's A Little Prayer. I've now isolated every single one of those chord shifts. I've actually remedied a lot of the issues that would naturally be happening while playing a chorale. Now we're going to move on to the second example. This is Ivan Trevino's Anthem. Ivan writes a lot of works that are very accessible to advanced high school students as well as undergraduate students. And they're also very tonal, making the shifting between chords very, very important that we play correct notes. So first, I'll go ahead and play this opening section of his piece, Anthem. So very, very simple, nice kind of melodic phrase here. But what's actually happening underneath, getting these chord shifts are incredibly important. To be able to jump back and forth between those two, if we start shuffling around and missing some notes in there, it becomes very, very obvious because his writing is very, very tonal. So what would be very useful is if we could take a double vertical exercise that works on advanced shifts and be able to apply it to the top of this exercise. So to demonstrate this, I've taken the exercise SRT by Atlanta Quest. Now this is a double vertical exercise, and as you can see, it differs from the first example in the sense of that we're just combining more and more advanced rhythms to really isolate that wrist stroke. So just playing SRT, just to give you an example of what this would sound like. So as you can see, these rhythms are significantly faster than the double vertical strokes of the previous exercise, making them very, very effective when we're trying to develop this ability to jump back and forth between chords. So if I were to take SRT and apply it to Ivan Trevino's Anthem, we would actually get this. Now that I've taken an exercise that incorporates much faster rhythms and much faster double vertical strokes and applied it to this to the piece, now being able to shift between these chords is going to become significantly easier. Now let's look at this next section from Ivan Trevino's Anthem. So this is the second passage of this piece. I'll go ahead and play this. So now we're beginning to shift around the keyboard a lot more, and we're actually integrating what I was mentioning before, a combination stroke. So now we're actually incorporating more advanced stroke types into the actual playing. So what we can do is we can actually break that stroke down and isolate it by using an exercise like Urbina Outfitters from Pulse. Pulse is a very good indoor percussion group. Urbina Outfitters, obviously a play on Urban Outfitters and named after their instructor, Eric Urbina. So this exercise would sound like this. So we're isolating the single independent stroke and then going only into our inside stroke. So, and even as you can see, just the similarity between the two different examples, they look pretty similar in how they're actually notated. So I can now apply the Urbina Outfitters exercise to Ivan Trevino's Anthem. And we would get something like this. Now, once the piece is, it's easy to play through the Urbina Outfitters, and then applying it in this way, all of a sudden going back to the original source material will become significantly easier because we've isolated a specific stroke type and found an exercise that addresses that one thing and applied it to the piece. Now let's move on to the Bach G major cello suite. So the first two examples here were largely giving technical breakdowns of how these pieces can be kind of riveting and some of these issues can kind of be addressed. As we get further and more complex with the exercise that we're applying to it, you're going to start to hear that there's more of an improvisation kind of dynamic that's being added to it. So I'm going to go ahead and start by playing the Bach G major prelude, and then I'll demonstrate how we can break it down in a variety of ways. Excuse me. Looking at ways that we can apply specific exercises to the Bach G major prelude. Excuse me. The exercise that we're going to use for this one is actually called Double Latte by the Phantom Regiment. This is a lateral stroke exercise. Essentially what this does is it takes a lateral stroke in each hand and then works it through various permutations. So I'll go ahead and demonstrate the first bit of this. continue and work itself through other variations on this, starting with the inside mallet, and then eventually starting on the left hand as well. Now, this method works very, very effective if I'm able to isolate a specific chord progression. So I'm going to go ahead and take the first 4 measures of the Bach G major prelude and apply this sticking pattern to it. Now, a couple of things are going to happen here. One, I'm actually going to be able to control the nuance and the shading of the bar, or where I'm actually playing on the bar, to try to change my touch and my approach to the actual keyboard. And 2, as I change the different permutations, you're going to hear different chord tones speak out depending on if I'm starting on the downbeat or if they're being played more frequently, which is going to be able to allow us to hear those different ones pop out. So as I'm playing through this, see if you can kind of hear the different colors change as we apply different sticking patterns. So now we can actually play with which of those chord tones we want to bring through. And as you can see, as I'm applying more of a mixed meter exercise on top of a Bach, now we're actually starting to get into more of a realm of improvisation. We're creating new textures and new colors out of the exercise being applied to the specific marimba piece. All right, the next piece we're going to look at is Japanese children's songs by Keiko Abe. I will go ahead and play this piece in its entirety, and then we'll break down some of the passages. So this is Variations on Japanese Children's Songs by Keiko Abe. we're just going to take this exercise called broccoli. Broccoli is a very popular front ensemble exercise. I mentioned that the green scales were ubiquitously used between all the other front ensemble packets. Broccoli was the second most commonly used exercise. What broccoli is a lateral stroke exercise. So for this one, we will take our normal permutation of 1, 2, 3, 4, and then be able to grid that through a variety of different permutations. Gridding basically taking one concept and slowly shifting it through different rhythmic structures. So if I were to play a little bit of broccoli, it would sound like this. Permutations one at a time, which sounds like this. I've now taken that one rhythmic cell and then moved it over slowly over time. So now, what if we were to take broccoli and apply it to Japanese children's songs? Now, I mentioned earlier this method works very, very effectively when there are 4-bar structures or chord progressions that are very, very clear and obvious. Within this section we're going to use is this left-hand ostinato with the right-hand accompaniment. This method, sometimes the music needs to be adjusted in a variety of ways in order to be able to apply this method on top of it. So the first thing I did with this is I applied double vertical strokes to everything. Once I've learned it with just double verticals filling in every single note, I can then apply more of this method to it. So if I were to take that same idea of filling in the right hand and then apply the broccoli exercise, specifically the last part of it, I would end up getting this. She said in a lesson, his former teacher used to tell him, if you're having problems with a section, make it harder. This certainly takes this passage and makes it significantly harder. But you can start to, now that we're applying more extremes to the skill sets that are being applied to the actual melodic material, we're really now getting into the area of creating something new. So if I were to take, let's just say I take this same section, I now have added this permutation, the broccoli permutation, directly to it. Let's say if I were to just take it up the octave and just shift the bass note halfway through, all of a sudden we really have our own new composition. So that, if we were to just do something as simple as that, this is what we would get. And merely changing the octave or perhaps one note in the bass, I am actively improvising with the structure of the piece and I'm creating my own music out of that. So now we're going to go to the last piece of this presentation. We're going to look at My Lady White. And My Lady White is written by composer David Maslanka. David Maslanka is a well-known composer for wind band, as well as writing a few significant percussion pieces as well. So I'm going to start off by just playing this second movement of David Maslanka's My Lady White. Let's go. So I'll start off by playing just the second movement of David Maslanka's My Lady. As you can see, there are lots of very technical and difficult passages throughout that piece. And this is one that I've worked on for quite a while, breaking down in a variety of different ways. So specifically, I want to go to this passage here, which I'll demonstrate again so I remember which one it is, and go through each of these steps to show how we can formulaically go through this entire section. We can actually extrapolate all those ideas to make a small etude out of it, and then we can actually take those ideas and apply them to new compositions. So just as a reminder, this is the passage from the piece that we're going to be looking at. So, a lot of notes in a very short period of time. And, as with much of Maslanka's writing, it's very, very tonal. So, accuracy is very, very important. So the first thing I would do with my method, I would break it down with double vertical strokes. The next step would then be to apply single independent strokes. In this one, I've applied a 2 on a mallet exercise, so that would sound like this. 2 measures at a time. I'm going to add a little bit of shaping and phrasing, and all of a sudden I'm actually starting to create my own mini etude purely out of these 6 bars. So purely from the reorganization of isolated stroke types rooted in practicing this one passage, I'm actually able to create my own new musical idea out of that passage. So in closing for the lecture, I would now like to take this exact same excerpt and play a piece of my own composition in which I draw significantly from that material. So this is a piece that I wrote called "O Red, Red Rose." It's named after the Robert Burns poem of the same title. In this piece, you'll be able to hear as I kind of borrow from a couple of different ideas, but in the middle section, hopefully you'll be able to hear the direct reference and influence of that passage from My Lady White. This is a piece that I wrote for my wife, who is my red, red rose. this quote by Keiko Abe one more time and really try to drive home the idea of how important improvisation is into the understanding and the comprehension of the music that we play. It is not about the notes on the page, it is about the vocabulary, it is about the history, it is about everything else that goes into writing and putting the ink on the page that truly matters when it comes to writing this music. So, in closing, I want to re-emphasize the marching arts provide a structural framework for significant achievement when this pedagogical approach of technique exercises being applied to music can then be transferred into the study of solo marimba literature and allow us to develop a way and a grounds for improvisation that is rooted in a vocabulary and a history of music that makes sense. And at that point, I'm happy to take questions. Yes? Yeah.
Are there any limitations or things, like pieces or maybe things that you found maybe don't work as well with this method or that need to be major adjustments?
Yeah, I mean, the Keiko Abe is certainly a good example of that. Whenever we have two different techniques happening in each of the hands, so that's where the limitation primarily comes in and where we need to isolate one at a time. That was not something I did not do in this research, was try to do different techniques in one hand to the next. That wasn't part of this. It certainly could be applied. But this works most effectively when we can isolate a small snippet of information and then apply all these different things to it. So even with like the Bach cello prelude, like to try to apply this technique to the entire piece, you certainly could. But if we just take like the first four measures and maybe a middle section or something like that, then we're actually going to be able to be able to diagnose some of those things. But the Japanese children's songs I wanted to include specifically for the fact that I had to make major changes to that. Even in applying like, so in going through with double verticals like I have in my document, I had to change the time signature subtly to make it all fit together. Or, I mean, purely just from changing the amount of notes that we play in our right hand. Yes, so there are certainly limitations to it. The idea would be how, and I guess that's kind of the creative process as well, is like how you would manage those different problems. I think an important thing to say is there is no like real wrong answer when it comes to making an adjustment or making a shift to one thing or another. It's all about the exploration kind of process of just experimenting with the keyboard. One of the big things I didn't mention when it comes to improvisation is it really forces us to listen. When we're improvising on the keyboard, we get an immediate feedback and a result of what is happening. But if I'm not actually listening to the notes that are happening, then I'm not actually engaging with the improvisation process. I'm just kind of moving my hands. And it's very easy for us when we do play solo literature to just kind of get into that same kind of muscle rote mindset and just play and no longer listen to the sounds we're making. Yes, Dr. Walter.
Really nice job. Thank you for all of this. So a couple things, when I hear the progression, culminating in your composition and having heard other compositions of yours, I tend to hear a lot of the same, not about your composition necessarily, but I think part is that this approach, this like
great ideas come from trying concept, apply it in novel ways. So I think in trying to be more novel, or trying to get outside that box, is trying to be more creative in the way that we kind of combine these various different kinds of ideas. So I guess that's one way. Yes, it is very formulaic. Purely the fact that it's being drawn on 4 basic show types and this core kind of exercises makes it very formulaic. So I guess to answer that, how do I personally try to, is trying to throw in an extra like wrench that will kind of like change where we're at. One of the things I've done, there's a really good guitar book called The Generic Modality Compression. It's a Berkeley Press book. So I've tried taking those exercises and using those as my harmonic structure. So I'll apply these same kind of concepts, but purely for the fact that I'm working from an instrument that is no longer the marimba forces this to sound different. So the source material, whether it's working with solo marimba literature, so for me personally, I try to find other instruments. That book in particular gives you a lot of really interesting chord tones and qualities. So that's one way that I try to. And then to get into the other question, like I know in chatting with Bob has a tonal system that he always works from. So similar in the sense of like I have a rhythmic technical structure that things work from. He has a 9-tone row scale, it's not tone row, 9-tone scale that he always works from. So I remember specifically asking him this question, he can always reference back to that in order to keep it within this same kind of area, so it still sounds like water lilies, it still sounds like his pieces. So I think the idea of having a palette that you specifically work from, like he has his 9-tone system, this like technical approach would be the palette that I'm working from, at least in this kind of era of my compositions, gives it its own kind of identity. But to break out of that palette, yeah, I guess I personally try to pull from instruments that are not the marimba. I know that's getting more into the actual compositional process, whereas this was largely rooted in how can we better understand the literature that we're practicing. The next way that we could take that would be, how do we go find something that's not written for marimba and apply these same techniques for it. And I think that's a huge field. Like I've arranged, there's the Heitzer Villalobos 12 etudes for guitar. If we try to purely just put that guitar music on the marimba, it can be very clumsy, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. But if we were to go through it with this same kind of technical process, we'd be able to make something that reflects the original material and also is idiomatic for the instrument. Did that get all the questions?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, Brandon.
I see the method kind of in its application to lots of specific technical skills like rotations, like verticals, lateral strokes, things like that. I was wondering, one thing that feels like is also like a divergence or difference from marching percussion to concert percussion or percussion that uses improvisation is expression through dynamics and tempo. And that's something where I'm curious if you think the method can also be applied is in teaching like marching percussionists or percussionists who play a lot of rote material to be as expressive or dynamic as people who are playing lots of solo literature like original compositions or improvising.
Yeah, and that's what I kind of loved about this research is we're putting rules and constraints on it, and in doing so we are trying to be more expressive, right? In applying these different rules, we are actually being able to be more expressive. So yeah, there are definitely different ways that we've practiced this. In practicing with Ian, we took the broccoli exercise and tried to put accents on every 3 beats. I regret doing this right now. And trying to move where that accent sits within the actual groove. That's certainly one way. We can play with like where we actually put accents into the actual phrasing. When it comes to keyboard percussion, one of the things that I always try to strive is why this instrument is different than playing like rudimental drumming is oftentimes, and you obviously know better than I do within this field, but we often think of things as accents and taps, right? It's a very binary kind of system. We have full strokes and we have our tap strokes. That's often a way that we kind of approach stuff unless we're kind of playing crescendos, that kind of thing. I really try to emphasize that when we are playing on the keyboard, even in the front ensemble, we shouldn't apply things with accents and taps. I try to use the analogy of breathe through a phrase like a trumpet player would. If I'm playing through a scale passage and I'm going to play it as a drummer, I might play with very answer your question, yes, there are certainly ways we can play and work on expression, groove, those kind of things. The danger then becomes, are we approaching this like a drum, or are we approaching this as its own keyboard instrument? And too often do we, marching percussionists, approach this like we're playing a drum, when it's not, obviously. Does that get all your questions? Okay. Any other questions? Yes, sorry.
So, is there a way to apply the opposite direction, step from solo marimba into the marching arts, or is that just like completely antithetical and antithesis of what they're looking for? Because it's very clear that they want uniformity and all those things, and it's not really what that is. Is there anything you can glean from this world that they might benefit from in their world?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that I talked a bit about in the document as well, is the integration of microphones into the front ensemble. So a reason why we do, like I mentioned, we have to play scale passages to balance for volume's sake. I mean, for a long time, up until 2004, I think is when they started to integrate electronics into the front ensemble. Up until then, it was purely an acoustic instrument designed for the call that was not able to balance to a bunch of drums behind it. Now that's actually changed. Now we can actually approach this more as a soloistic kind of keyboard. So you see composers like Sandy Rennick, the way that she writes for, if you look at Phantom Regiment in the early 2000s and St. Clair Vanguard now, the way that she writes is much more soloistic in approach, but it's still rooted in this concept of defining stroke types. Having not worked with Sandy, I'm imagining that's like kind of how she would go through that process. But yes, if you were to look at a front ensemble now compared to 30 years ago, the approach is going to be much more soloistic, but still very much controlled in this piston stroke kind of approach. So yes, there's definitely been a blending of the two worlds, and that's largely because we do have microphones, so we can be more arpeggios and that kind of stuff that wouldn't have spoke through the ensemble before. So yes, there's definitely been a shift of incorporating more solo marimba literature, as well as arrangements. Solo marimba arrangements are often used in the front ensemble as source material. That's pretty common. But yeah, you would never see anybody, nobody's gonna be playing traditional rip and playing like Erico does, where it's like, that's not realistic. Sometimes you can define it, I suppose, but well, I mean, I shouldn't say never, because there are absolutely groups, like the level of playing now is so unbelievably high compared to what it was, not to knock anybody like 2000 and earlier, but I mean, there's a very distinct difference in all aspects of marching band. I mean, music in general, probably. Yeah. Well, if there are no more questions, I would be more than happy to discuss this further after this as well. So if there is anything that pops up to you, please reach out to me. I would be happy to answer more.